So this video is going to be part one of the elimination method to solve systems of equations. The first thing that we're going to talk about is just what is the elimination method. I'm going to write down the definition here and you can pause and so the definition of elimination method, or a little bit about what it is elimination is another way to solve systems of equations. So previously we learned about graphing them and we also learned about substitution. Elimination is a good method to use when you can't substitute but you still need to solve two equations. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to recognize when you should be using elimination in just a second. So here we have our first example where we're going to use elimination in order to solve. So we have two equations here, 2t plus 5r equals 6 and 9r plus 2t equals 22. The reason why we can recognize this as a problem where we should use elimination is because usually you'll have both variables on the same side and then the numbers by themselves on one side here. So we're going to go over first the steps on what you should do in order to solve, and then we will get into a little bit. Here I wrote the first step, which is to line up the variables. In this case, our two variables are t and r. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite it so that the t's are lined up and that r is lined up. So the first one, I'm going to keep this the same. So I'm going to not move anything with the first equation. I'll just copy the exact same thing down. 2t plus 5r equals 6. But the second one, because we want t to be lined up with t and r to be lined up with r, I'm going to rearrange the second equation so that they're lined up. So I'm going to move this 2t to the front here. So 2t is going to go first, and then 9r is going to go afterwards. So plus 9r. When you're moving around these variables, just pay attention to whether or not these are positive or negative. In this case, the 9 is a positive 9, which is why I kept this as a plus 9, and the 2t had a plus sign in front of it as well, which is why I kept it as positive. When you're doing this step, it is very, very important to keep track of any positive or negative numbers. The 22 is already lined up with the number, so I'm not going to move that one. That one will stay where it's at. So now you can see, after I've done step one, the t's are lined up together and the r's are lined up together and the numbers are lined up together. Once you have lined everything up, then you can move on to the second step. So I wrote right here the second step. I'm going to move it up a little bit so that we can see. But step 2 is to subtract the two equations to eliminate a variable. So what I'm going to do is these whole equations, I'm going to subtract them from each other. So I'm going to write a minus sign right here. And I want to eliminate one of the variables, either eliminate the t's or eliminate the r's. In this case, if you look really carefully, if I subtract this, I can subtract 2t minus 2t. If we were to take 2 minus 2, that would give us 0, which means we would completely get rid of and we could cross out this variable right here. So that is our goal. When we subtract, we want to get rid of at least one of them and then leave the other variables behind. So in this case, I'm going to add a little note that we will eliminate the t variable in this case. So let's take a look at what happens when we subtract. 2t minus 2t. That leaves us with 0, and instead of writing 0, I'm just going to cross these out and not write anything to avoid confusion. Now I just need to subtract these variables, 5r minus 9r. 5 minus 9 is going to be negative 4r, and then we need to subtract our numbers, 6 minus 22. 6 minus 22 is going to give us negative 16. Once we subtract, you can see this looks a lot more like an equation that we can solve. We can easily solve and figure out what r is. So I wrote out in step 3 here, we're going to solve for the remaining variable, in this case r. So I'm going to divide by -4 on both sides, and this tells me r is +4. Now the rest of this, to solve for the other one, for t, we just do the same that we did during substitution. Pick one of these equations. I'll just choose the first one. It doesn't matter which one you use. Both of them will work. So choose one of the equations, the original equations, and plug in what you got for r. So here, down below, I'm going to write out the equation that I picked. I picked the first one. So I wrote down 2t plus 5r equals 6. And then again, after we pick one of the equations, we plug in our answer to solve for t. So I said that r was 4, so I'm going to plug in 4 for r. And then now we just solve using some simple algebra. So we multiply these two together, 5 times 4 to get 20. Next, we can minus 20 on both sides. That leaves us with 2t on this side and -14 on this side. And then we can divide by 2 on both sides, leaving us with our answer, t is -7. And then just like with our substitution, make sure that you write them as coordinate points if possible. Since this time our variables are not x and y, we will just write down our r value first. We'll write them as r, comma t. So we'll write this as 4 and -7 as our answer. If you had x and y, you would write x first and then y first. Here we have a practice problem, so go ahead and pause the video. Try to solve this on your own. If you need to go back and look at what the steps are again, I would suggest you do that in order to solve for both variables using elimination. So I'm going to show you now how we would solve this equation. First step is to line up the variables. So I'm going to write down the first one, keep that the same. So 8b plus 3c equals 11. Now the second one, I'm going to move stuff around so that the variables are lined up. So I want the b's to be lined up, so I'm going to put 8b right here. And then 7c will go after that so that I line up the c's. And 7 will stay the same. Once I have done step 1, the variables are lined up, I'm now going to subtract the equations. So I'm going to subtract these two. 8 minus 8 is 0, so those cancel out. 3 minus 7 is -4c, and 11 minus 7 is 4. Now I just divide by 4 on both sides, or -4, and I get -1 for c. So I've subtracted it, and I've also solved for the variable c. After solving for that, I can solve for the other variable by plugging it back into the original equation. Again, you can use either one of the original equations. I'm just going to use the first one. So I'm going to write down that equation, 8b plus 3c equals 11, and I'm going to plug in what I got for c, so -1. So I'm going to plug in -1 into the equation, and now I multiply these together. 3 times -1, and then I'm going to add 3 on both sides. This gives me 14, and then I'm going to divide on both sides by 8. In this case, I'm left with a fraction, so I'm going to simplify this fraction. b is going to be 7. This is going to be our last example, example 2, and we are going to use elimination again to solve for the variables. I'm going to write out the steps on the side, and then I want you to pause and see if you can figure out how to solve this problem. Here are all the steps that you need in order to solve. Try to read them carefully, and then see if you can solve this on your own. So if you looked carefully, you might have noticed that the step is slightly different from the previous ones we've done. Let's take a look at how. Step 1 is going to be the same. Line up the variables. So I'm going to keep this top one the same. I'm going to start with 4x plus 6y equals 32. but I need x to be lined up with each other and y to be lined up with each other. So this 3x is going to go in front here so that I can line them up. And the y's are going to be lined up. This negative 6y is going to go here so that I can line up the y's. Notice how because that was a negative 6, I'm now writing it as minus 6y. The numbers were already lined up, so I don't need to do anything there. After lining up the variables, you'll notice that this problem is a little different. Before, we had positives. Now we have a positive and a negative. This is going to change how we solve. In step 2, if you read it carefully, this time we're actually going to add the equations together. The reason why we're adding them instead of subtracting is because, remember, our goal is to eliminate one of the variables, hence the name elimination. In order to eliminate the 6y and the negative 6y, we can add 6 plus negative 6, because those will always equal 0. So, because of the positive and the negative, we're now going to add them together to eliminate our variable. When I add these together, it's going to equal 0, so I'm going to cross that out. Next, I'm going to add the rest of the equation together. 4x plus 3x, that's going to give us 7x. 32 plus 3 is going to give us 35. And then the rest is just going to be solving for x, which in this case, x is going to be equal to 5. And then step 4 is going to be the same. Plug it into one of the original equations to solve. I'm going to just use the first one. So I'm going to use 4x plus 6y equals 32. I'm going to plug in x equals 5 and solve for y. 4 times 5 is 20. I'm going to subtract 20 on both sides. This leaves me with 6y equals 12. Divide by 6 on both sides. Y is going to be equal to 2. Now that I've solved for x and y, I'm going to leave my final answer as a coordinate point, which means in the form x, comma, y. So x was 5, y was 2. So my final answer will be 5, comma, 2. There are a lot more steps for elimination than there are for substitution. So I would suggest that you rewatch this video just to get a good understanding of the steps, and try to pause and solve these problems again on your own, just to make sure that you understand what to do.